Let's talk about the dating game. Is the earth thousands or billions of years old? So what we're going to, Mark 10:6 says this, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. An extremely powerful verse. Why is it so powerful? Well, it's so powerful because Jesus is speaking it. Jesus is the Word, right? In fact, in John 1, if you read it carefully, you'll notice that when it says the world, he's a light, the world is in darkness, did not receive him. But if you look at the context, they're talking about Jesus as creator is what they're not receiving, as well as Messiah. But they're not receiving him as creator because it's all about creation. He's the Word. He created all things. So Jesus, if anybody's going to interpret the Bible, it's got to be Jesus. He is the Word. He says, male and female were there at the beginning. Period. That's it. Is there time before Genesis 1 and 2? If male and female were there at the beginning, the answer is no. I mean, it's just logical. Or you have to say Jesus didn't know what he was talking about. Secondly, Paul says, and so it is written, the first Adam was made a living soul, and the last Adam was made a quickening spirit. So Adam wasn't an evolved monkey that God breathed into, or ancestor monkey, or whatever you want to say. Adam was a real person. The genealogies go back to Adam. The Bible talks about, Jesus talks about how they spilled the blood of the prophets back to Abel. Right? All real people. It doesn't make sense otherwise. So obviously Jesus believed in a very literal Genesis and a very recent earth. Here we have the genealogy in Luke 3:23-28, and Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being as was supposed the son of Joseph, son of Heli, etc., and which was the son of Enos, Seth, son of Adam, son of God. So there's no pre-creation. There's no pre-Adamic race. In fact, it gets, I'll do this. And it's inherent. An understanding of this is inherent. There's a reason why the Jewish calendar that we're in year 5,773. Why would they say 5,773? Because it's inherent that the earth is under 6,000 years old. It's the normal reading of the text. To make it read something else, you have to go to Bible college a long time. Okay? Because that's not what it says. If we're just to look at it, it's not going to say that. So there's no gap, and it makes things worse. And I'll get into it maybe a little later. I don't know if I have time. I'll just say this quickly because I don't think it comes up in my other talks. There's a big theological issue with trying to have time be extended and that the 6 days not be a 6 days, and that is concerning death. Now, death is a very important thing in our faith. The victory over death, that is. The resurrection. I mean, if Jesus was still in the tomb, would we be Christians? No. We'd be Buddhists. Buddha is still in the tomb. But we're not Buddhists. We're Christians because Jesus is not in the tomb. I've been there. I checked it out. It's empty. It really is. I've been there. I came out. Yay, it's empty. Good stuff. So, death is vitally important. Why did they call it the last enemy? Why did Jesus have to resurrect from the dead? Well, because death came by Adam, right? So if death came before Adam, how does the story work now? If fossils represent death before Adam, it doesn't make sense anymore. Death has to come by Adam, both spiritual and physical. And you say, maybe it was just humans. Wait. When Paul says, all creation waits for the redemption of the Son of Man. All creation is all creation. Okay? So, age of the earth, we'll get back to that in a moment. Now let's look at what Thomas Huxley said, 1867. You, the clergy, tell your congregations that the world was made 6,000 years ago in 6 days, and that all living animals were made within that period. I am bound to say, I do not believe these statements you make and teach. And I am further bound to say that I cannot call up to mind amongst the men of science and research and truthful men one who believes these things, but on the other hand, who does not believe the exact contrary. What? He just said that if you believe that, you're a liar. He says, He does not know of anybody who are men of science, truthful men, that do not believe the exact opposite. 1867. Now, the person who wasn't truthful was actually Thomas Huxley in this case, which was because it's not true at that point. The evolution was just getting off, and so that it wasn't true what he was saying. But this is what he said. And so it becomes, and it actually, the age of the earth undermines the faith to such an extent that it's the number one reason why we have lost whole denominations. It is the one key reason. And you'll see this as I go through. And it's vital. In 1896, there was a meeting between the Northern and Southern Presbyterians in North America. They got together to discuss the 6 days. Woodward, who was the president or the dean of Harvard, I believe, he claimed, he was a minister as well as an amateur geologist, and he claimed, no, those are thousands of years, millions of years, I mean. And Dabney said, no. He said, the only reason you accept those millions of years is the following. Science appears to have replaced the Word of God as the authority of determined truth. And he says it's explained this way. This happens because of our depraved mind and the exaltation of naturalism. Science has become the new religion. Scientists are the new priests. If I walk out here with a lab coat, I am now a pronouncer of truth, and you will believe me. It's true. If I walk out here but if I walk outside with a Bible, no one will believe me. If I walk out with a lab coat, everybody will believe me. That is the new truth. Remember, religion against religion, faith against faith. So if you exalt naturalism to the equal or above the Bible, and this is a dangerous thing because there are Christians that say, and it started with Francis Bacon, who wasn't exactly an exemplary Christian, but it started with him who said, there are 2 books. There's the book of the Bible and the book of nature, and they both are equal in importance. Excuse me? No, they're not equal in importance. Nature is the result of the Creator, and it's fallen. So you're not going to get all the right message by looking at nature. You're going to get some of the message. You want the right message, you go to the Bible. That's the authority. That's absolute truth. And so you can see where we're going here. Now, what happened to the Presbyterians was this, and this was all about the age question, all about the 6-day creation. The Northern Presbyterians said, we're going with Woodward, and we're not accepting that. And so Genesis, therefore, becomes what? Genesis becomes a poem, a sort of poetry that has some moral implications. Of course, what happens to Genesis 3:15? The serpent? The first prophecy about Jesus? What happens? Is that also an analogy? Where do you stop? Where does it stop being an analogy? How about the global flood? Oh, if you don't believe in the 6-day creation, I can guarantee you don't believe in a global flood. Oh, so Noah is just a story. Oh yeah, they took it from the Babylonians and Sumerians. They just adapted it to the Bible. Really? But we baptize people because of the flood. Jesus said in the final days it's going to be like in the days of Noah. If Noah wasn't a real person, what does that mean about the final days? Right? You can see there's an issue here. But then you don't stop there. Where are you going to stop? How about Tower of Babel? No Tower of Babel. In fact, you're going to go all the way to Abraham before you're going to start saying it's real history. You've taken off the foundation. Remember Psalms 11:3 last night? What do the righteous do when the foundations perish? So, the Southern Presbyterians said, no, we believe exactly what Genesis says. What's the result 100 years later? The Northern Presbyterians are a social club. The Southern Presbyterians developed evangelism explosion and have brought over 22 million people to the Lord. That's how important, I believe, the age question is. Okay? Uniformitarian geology, it's the most effective weapon ever launched against the Word of God. If you look at Luther, Finney, and Calvin, these were important people, but Lyell came up with this idea, and that went against what Luther and Finney and Calvin were saying. The present is the key to the past. And this is all about, but the present cannot be the key to the past. It's the Bible that's the key to the past. Present, there's been catastrophes. Worldwide flood is going to change things really quick. Babel's going to change things. The fall of man, remember roses they all of a sudden have thorns. Agriculture becomes much more difficult. Many things change at the fall. So the present can't be the key to the past. But that's what Lyell said, Charles Lyell. And look what he said also. He said this: I had conceived of the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic chronology could be set down without giving, set down, that means put away with, without giving offense, it would be in a historical sketch. That's very Old English, but what he's saying here, he said, if I could create a story that could replace the Moses story, the Genesis story, that's what he wants to do. He said, I want to create a sketch. I want to create a story. And that's exactly what he did here in the Principles of Geology in 1830, and he went around the world trying to get evidence for these long ages. Now let's look at and that was the beginning of the idea that eventually got up to billions of years old, being the Earth being 5 billion years or 4.67 billion years old. And the Bible, of course, talks about thousands of years. So let's see what the evidence is. I like doing science, and let's take a look at this. That's why I was brought here. So this is the imaginary fossil record. I call it the imaginary. The idea in your textbooks is that you have trilobites. Remember that Cambrian explosion? All these things start appearing here. And then throughout, in other words, it gives you the idea that if you just dig down, you're going to find these fossils in this order. That is not true, actually, but that's what they want you to think is true. So let's go into this in a little more detail. All fossils are in sedimentary rock. I have fossils here. We'll talk about some of them. Normally I have much more, but on the plane it's a little difficult. These fossils are all, no matter what color they are, they're made in sedimentary rock. And sediment cannot be dated. Why can sediment not be dated? Because it's a mix of rock, right? It's mud. So you can't get any good dates out because you don't know what part of the mix you're dating. So there is no fossil that's ever been dated. You have to date other types of rock that are around, hopefully nearby the fossil, igneous rock or granites or something. You have to date something else. You can't date the fossil because it's, well, at least not with mineral dating, because it's sedimentary rock. So that's the first thing to note. Okay, now, how do we date rocks? Let's start with where these dates come from. This is straight from an encyclopedia. It says this: to date a rock or rock formation, it is essential to be able to figure out where it fits in the geological column. Sedimentary rocks are easily dated by the fossils they contain. What? Let's read that again. Get your thinking cap on here. Sedimentary rocks are easily dated not by radiometric methods, but by the fossils they contain. Microfossils, there are about 10 microfossils, or maybe a bit more. One of them is a trilobite that is supposed to have a specific age. Okay, so they're being dated by the fossils. All right, so let's keep going. To be able to reconstruct the history of the Earth is within the realm of geology, and to do this, one must be able to control time, that is to date the events. Relative geological dating relies basically upon sedimentary rock formations. So we need to look at those formations of rock to find out where they fit in the world, now across the globe. So to establish a global time frame, it's necessary to make correlations between one region and another. So we find one type of sedimentary rock in Nova Scotia. The same type shows up in England with the same microfossil, and we're going to say it's the same age. Fossils are a precious tool to do this. In other words, it's not really based on the type of rock, but on the fossils that are contained in the rock for the age we're going to give it. This is important. Now, have I mentioned anything about radiometric dating yet? I've just mentioned fossils. Two sedimentary rock formations containing the same fossils are the same age. Okay, this is what they do. All right. Now, the question that should be running around your head is, how do you know the age of the fossils? That's an excellent question. They call it absolute dating, which it isn't really. The measure of the radioactive isotope radiogenic, that's just isotope, that means radioactive dating, in a rock where we know the initial concentration permits us to determine its age. Woo, red flag. We have to know what? The initial concentration. Likely no one was there 4 billion years ago when that rock formed to measure the initial concentration. So right away, we're nullifying the initial need for that to be absolute. Okay? The combination of these, so what do you do with that? Since no one's there, almost ever, to do this, Well, then you have to find another way of calibrating. So what do? The combination of these processes, dating by fossils and isotopic tracing, permits us to imagine, and imagine is a good word to use here, evolutionary scenarios of what happened on Earth. Okay, so what they've said is basically, if we use radiometric dating, we need to know the initial concentrations. We don't know the initial concentrations, so we're going to have to look at the fossils that are nearby, the rocks, the fossils, and because we know their ages, that'll tell us if we're getting the right dates or not. But how do we know the age of the fossil? The sediment? But how do we know the age of the sediment? The fossil. Because what's happened is they've just said this fossil is 600 million years old. How do you know that? It didn't come like with a label. So there's a problem. There's a circular reasoning that happens here. And you can't tell how old it is because radiometric dating has a lot of issues, as I'm going to show you in a moment. Okay. Now, if you didn't believe me, this is carbon-14, but I think it's the same type of process. Look at, this is a sample. So you send in a sample to a lab. This is a sample sheet from a lab. And look at the question. You can't see it. I'll read it at the bottom. You have to put in at the bottom, expected age, and please provide any previous C14 dates and relative and cultural paleo-environmental information. In other words, we'll date this, but you tell us how old it is before we do. Wow, no wonder it comes out right. Isn't that amazing? Okay. Now, this geological column would represent a cross-section through the Earth's crust. Youngest rocks at the surface and oldest rocks at the bottom. That's what they want you to believe. It's supposed to represent the total sedimentary activity of all ages, and textbooks suggest the column would be at least 100 miles thick. But is the column a real fact or a hypothetical classification scheme used to support evolution? Is it a real fact? Does it exist? Well, let's take a look at that very quickly. It would consist of 10 layers. Remember, 10 microfossils? Doesn't matter with the rock, just for fossils. All 10 plus layers can be found in very few locations, less than 1% of the Earth's surface. How come? How come something that's been going on for billions of years can't be identified more than in 1% of the Earth's surface? The worldwide average thickness of the column is 1 mile. But if we were to have present accumulations of sediment over the time frame they're talking about, it should be 100 miles thick. But it's 1 mile. You see, the issue is they want so much time to make the impossible possible in biology that they've gone beyond the reasonable at an atomic level. We can only make layers so thin. You know what I mean? And you have to have like a perfect environment, make layers atomic thin. You're still not going to get 100 plus miles. It's about a mile. The standard column was built on superposition of many different locations. So what they do is they take a location here and then they add it there. And they say this was above this one because we see this fossil here. But in fact, there's nowhere where you're actually going to find this. Maybe in Dakota, there's one place. So it can be found in textbooks. So it should be 160 kilometers thick. And the actual place where we do see this in Dakota, it's 1.5 kilometers. So it doesn't match the model. Now, let's look at the strata. So the strata, remember, is supposed to represent time. If that's the case, we have some real big issues. We have what we call the great unconformity. So if you look here in the Toro Weep and Kebab Formation, this is in the Grand Canyon, you see these rocks here. See different color, rock, easy to color because you can see the color. The problem is, for an evolutionist, the bottom rock and the top rock, the Docks Formation, the darker sediments, they're supposed to be 1 billion years old, and the top part is 500 million years old. How do you get absolutely no erosion for 500 million years? You can't even put a piece of paper between the two. It's not reasonable to say that this non-conformity represents 500 million years of time. There's actually no accumulation. It's gone. There is no 500 million years. Doesn't make sense. It would seem to represent something laid down really quickly, wouldn't it? Didn't have time for erosion, a water event. How about this one? This is in, if you want to take a look at some of there's a friend of mine, Canadian, called Ian Juby, Juby. I would really suggest you go out on the internet. I think his code name is Wazulu, but if you put in Ian Juby, you'll find this stuff. He has a TV program that he does in Canada, well, it's on the internet called Genesis Week, a weekly program, and he has video rants that are just hilarious. And he explains this stuff really well. And these are actually pictures Ian Juby sent me of, he actually went out there to look at this stuff himself and took a video camera, just, walked around with it. It's not the best thing to do mountain climbing, holding a video camera. I'll explain why in a moment. Okay, so here's an issue. This rock's 75 million years old, and this one's 520 million years old. And yet it's just one on top of the other. If we look at this, the Yanuska Mountains in Banff, Canada, that's what we just looked at, the Yanuska Mountains. If we look at here's close by, you can see there's really there's no slickicides. So slickicides are when rocks, what they say is that rocks they moved over these ones. Well, when rocks move over things, they sort of scrape them up. And they call these slick and slides, but there are no slick and slides in this rock. So it doesn't show any evidence of having slid over the other rock. Castle Mountain in Banff, Canada, 600 million years, 200 years, 400 million years missing. Where's the contact line? There's no contact line. It actually just melds one into the other. Would mean it's the same time. Here's in the Grand Canyon. You see these formations, hundreds of millions of years difference, and yet it goes from the lower, middle, lower, higher, lower, higher, lower, higher, lower, higher. And so what you actually have is a mixing of the two. That would simply mean that this is the same age as that, not a deposition, a slow deposition over time. Now, the theory of the old Earth is this, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old and 37 seconds. Very precise, isn't it? It's the central dogma of evolution upon which all evolutionary theory depends. In fact, I can guarantee that if you talk about the age of the Earth, as I do, somewhere along the way, someone's going to explode. I call it exploding. They take bets when I'm in France. We'll see what happens in this trip. Every time I've gone to France, there's one professor at some point who's going to lose it. Just starts screaming and running out the door. Just loses it. He can't control themselves anymore because this is too powerful. When you show the Earth is young, everything falls apart. It's gone. Very powerful. Consequence, there's a deep interest and motivation in maintaining the ideology of an old Earth because the central dogma. Let's look at these radiometric dating. So, if we take potassium to argon, we'll get to carbon-14 later. That's an organic method. Potassium, argon, so the function is to date volcanic rock. Remember, we can't date sedimentary rock, we can't date fossils. So, we're going to date volcanic rock. And we can look at potassium. So the idea is you start off with potassium, radioactive potassium, in the rock. Now, it would be good to know the initial concentration. You have to make some guess. And it'll change over to calcium and argon. Argon is a gas. And so what you do is you measure in the rock the amount of argon, the ratio of K40 to R40, and they estimate it takes 1.3 billion years for half of the K40 to be changed to non-radioactive and the argon. So in other words, the idea is you start off with no argon, just potassium 40, and then if you have half ratio, then you've gone over 1.3 billion years. Okay, sort of like a sundial in a game, very much like a sundial. Problem is you don't know how much is there in the initial element. That's a big problem, as you'll see in a moment. So the rate of degradation must be really known. We really need to know this speed. Is it really known? Keep in mind, you do a test for 4 months and you extrapolate 1.3 billion years. You may have some levels of error that are unacceptable. There must be no incorporation of the daughter element, because if you get extra daughter element in, it's going to look artificially old, isn't it? Right? And that's going to become important in this method. The system must be a closed system. So during all this billions of years, you can't have leaching, you can't have changes of temperature, you can't have changes in pressure. So your rock you're testing, that's lava rock that's come out of a volcano that's been in the crust of the earth, mustn't have changed over 1 billion years. Is that a reasonable criteria? Should we be asking a few questions here? The problems are, first of all, the elements in potassium, argon, we know they can migrate. We know they move. Potassium is a fertilizer. It better migrate. It uses water. And so you heat, erosion, water intrusion. In fact, they notice that the mineral itself can absorb argon under certain conditions. So if you have 1,300 degrees Celsius, It'll absorb at 1 atmospheric pressure, 0.33 ppm. What's the significance of that? That is, a rock with an average concentration of potassium-40 would be given an age of 570 million years if it contained only 0.1 ppm of argon. But the rock itself can be shown to absorb 30 times that, just if there's argon around. So we have some questions to ask about this dating method. 80%, they tested this, 80% of the potassium contained in a sample leached out just with water flowing over it. So you need a rock that's in a desert for 1 billion years. Is that reasonable? So what happens is that when you have water, the argon sticks around, the potassium goes, and your rock becomes instantly old in no time. And our atmosphere contains argon, and of that argon, 99.6 is argon-40. So the quantity is 100 times superior to the quantity that we produce by the degradation of potassium. So let's look at some measurements. This is Mount Gurahu, and there's been 70 eruptions since 1839, 17 eruptions since 1954, and stronger eruptions since 1975. So we're going to measure where we're there. So we know this. These are samples. We know they're less than 50 years old. We know that, okay, because we've been there. So the real age is less than 50 years, 100% certain. Okay? Now when we take those samples to a lab, what do we get? 270, you can't see this because I'm in the way, but 270,000 years, 1 million years, 1.5 million years, 3.5 million years. But we know it is 50 years old. Got a problem here, right? Okay, let's keep going. More results. Hawaii. This is in red you have when the rock was formed, and those are the dates given by the labs. 1.4 million, but it's only 200 years old. All for the same reason, because the initial element is getting out of it, and there's lots of the daughter element in the atmosphere. So you're getting really false dating on these ages, and they're all over the board. Okay. Mount St Helens exploded. Now, less than 26 years. Actually, it's a little more than 26 years now. It'd be about 30. And in this volcano that went off, it actually cooled the earth by 2 degrees for a year. About 40% of the mountain blew off on the north side, and it created some very interesting things for us to look at in terms of stratification. But, of course, it's a volcano, so we have volcanic rock, so we know how old it is. Let's date it. So they dated the volcanic rock, and it comes out with a dating between 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. But it is 30 years old. We got an issue here. We got something to look at. Okay. Now, in the uranium lead dating, which is even supposed to give older dates than potassium argon, there are 28 different changes that take place before it gets to uranium lead. And here's something that happened that was very interesting when this was presented. In 1986, 140 crystals, zircons, or like black mica, were extracted from the same rock. So they should all have the same age, right? They're extracted from the same rock. And they dated, this was published, they dated these rocks. But the results were so widely dispersed that they threw out 139 of the 140 and kept one. And they published with the one. Wow. How did they know the one was right? The magic of relative dating with fossils. The one fit their model. So it means they've already decided the ages beforehand. The one giving 4.3 billion years old, that's the one they took. It wasn't due to fossils because they already had decided how old it was. So when I presented this to, and similar criticisms, said the person writing this, Alexander Williams, of the isotope dating method to a gathering at the Lucas Heights Scientific Society in Australia, the only response came from the chief of the division responsible for the dating. He says this, "Do you have a better dating method?" And I said, "No." And he appeared satisfied with that answer. But can you ride a bicycle into the past simply because no one else has a better time machine? Of course not. In the same way, it's absurd to argue that an inadequate method is adequate because nothing better is available. They only hold on to radiometric dating because they need it to go against the young Earth. It's part of their dogma. Now, there are things that creationists have looked at in terms of why it's giving dates that are older than 10,000 years. Okay? and it is, and there's some ideas about that, but the datings themselves are not, they're all over the board, as you can see. Not really dependable. Now let's look at the young Earth. What do we have in terms of young Earth? Well, first of all, there's presence of carbon-14 in all geological strata. Now that's bizarre. We're going to look at this, the degradation of the Earth's magnetic field. We're going to look at the erosion of the continents. How are we doing on time? Okay. You still got 45 minutes to fast. You're becoming very spiritual by the minute. You can see your inner man is becoming stronger. Okay. I shouldn't have said anything. You would have thought of it. Anyway, okay. Carbon-14 works the same way as, well, sort of the same way as mineral methods. The idea is you have radioactive element that degrades into or loses its extra energy and becomes a lower energy value. And so the carbon-14 gets absorbed by plants. Plants are eaten by animals. The idea is that there'd be an equilibrium between us and the high atmosphere where the carbon-14 comes from, because it would filter down into the plants, and then we eat the plants, and so we get amount of C14 in eating the plants. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but actually this has come under a lot of attack recently, and this hypothesis may be totally invalid. But for the sake of the argument of what most people, this is very new science, it's coming out, and some people are really questioning the carbon dating being valid at all for anything beyond 2,000 years. But let's pretend it is valid for the sake of argument. What we do know about carbon is that it disappears really quick. Has a half-life of 5,730 years. So when you get to 5,730 years, you are at half, and then you're at a quarter, and then you're at an eighth. You understand what's happening? You divide by half each time. So you get lower, 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 and then you hit, well, basically zero. And so when you're around 50,000 years, you basically don't have any more carbon left. So if you find carbon-14 in a sample, it's come from two places. Either it's contamination, or that sample is under 50,000 years old. And if you have a substantial amount of carbon, it's probably under 10,000 years old. Look at the curve. It goes down really fast, and that you've got to be measurable. And we're at really low rates already here. We're only at 20%, and so we're getting into really low rates of carbon-14. So, now that you understand everything about carbon-14, okay, in the scientific literature, like radiocarbon and nuclear instruments and methods in physics research, they have measured over 15,000 samples throughout the years, and they all have carbon-14. Coal, wood, natural gas, carbon dioxide wells, bones, seashells, and marble. And what's fascinating about this is they all contain substantial and comparable quantities of C14. If they contain comparable quantities of C14, it means they have the same age. Now, coal is supposed to range between 40, 50 million years old to 300 million years old. How could it have any carbon-14 in it? And yet it does. Could it be contamination? Strange, because the laboratories are designed to remove all contamination. Very, very strong processes, very strong acids are used to get rid of contamination. So it's not contamination. So we have a good level of confidence. And in fact, there was the RAPE project, which was creationists getting together, and scientists, and 8 of them, I believe. They studied this, and they, amongst other things, they measured the amount of carbon-14 in coal and in 10 coal samples from 50, 100, 300 million years old, supposedly. They tested in a worldwide reputation laboratory. And the results you can see in the graph here are basically you have it centering between 0.2 and 0.4. So you have substantial amounts of carbon at a very young age, if you remember that graph I showed earlier on. So this would be, everything they're measuring are under 10,000 years old. And yet it's supposed to be 50 and 300 million. Fascinating stuff. Contamination error were taken into account. So in conclusion, organic material coming from virtually any stratum contains a comparable level of C14, C12. The direct conclusion is that geological strata were formed rapidly and recently, as would be expected from a recent global flood scenario. That's why this afternoon, at the same time as Dominic's doing his workshop, I'm going to be doing a workshop on the global flood, where we take a look, is there evidence for a global flood? Now let's continue about the young Earth age. So what else we have? We have degradation of the magnetic field. So the Earth has a magnetic field, And it basically shows the Earth could not be more than 20,000 years old. The Earth's magnetic field basically looks like this. We have a dynamo. We don't know how the dynamo works, by the way, to this day. 100 years of research, and we don't know how that dynamo actually produces what it produces around the Earth. But we have this shell of electromagnetic particles. It's how your compass works and knows where north and south is. Now, you can only put a magnetic strength, a field so strong until things start becoming liquid. They just start to fall apart. And if we measure, we know this, that the, let me go here. Okay, let me just get past it. Okay, we know this since 1835, that the electromagnetic field is decreasing 5% every 100 years. We know that. So this is an easy calculation. Let's go backwards, 5%. Increase it by 5% every 100 years. You can see that number is going to get big really fast. In 2000, they remeasured it. It's 1.4% over 30 years, about the same thing. Final results, half-life of 1,400 years. That's interesting. So you have this curve going down. Well, it's not a curve so much. It's a line going down. That's 1970 to 2000. So it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker. But how long can you go backwards? Well, let's put the graph up. I think I did some calculations here to show it. Going here, I think I've read it. The rate of energy loss is just too fast for Earth to be millions and billions of years old. If you look here, this is in Gauss, the way they measure magnetic field, 1965.31. So you go up, that's minus 800. This is like Isaiah time, minus 2,200. This is around, this will be just after the flood. We're already much, much stronger than we are now. You keep going back, now we get into some problem. If you go back like 19,000 years, 20,000 years, you have the electromagnetosphere of a star. The Earth isn't going to remain coherent in its core. That's not feasible. If you go back 50,000 years when Neanderthal was supposed to be roaming Europe, that number is so big, I'm not even sure it's possible. It just doesn't make any sense. Well, they say, yes, but there were cycles. Wait. Their cycles of magnetic change are 26,000 years. So I'm within the cycle, and it's too long. Now we know that there are quick changes, but it doesn't make any difference. You can't have what we have right now. There's no evidence that it's any different. It's just a straight measurement. It's going down 5% every 100 years. This would limit the age of the Earth to just a few thousand years. Even if we doubled things, let me see, even if I said there were 10,000 years as a half-life, it still would limit the age of the Earth to 160,000 years. Dinosaurs are supposed to have disappeared 65 million years ago. Something doesn't make sense here. Straight observations. This picture I took when I was in Switzerland, they laugh at me when I do conferences because I'm always looking at rocks. So they took me, in France, there's a famous windmill where they wrote Le Chèvre de Monsieur Séguin. And this is a well-known literary book. And so they thought, let's take them to see this well-known place and everything. And I'm really fascinated by the windmill because the blocks in it are full of fossils. And I'm looking at this, and they're like, oh, look at this. What's he doing looking at the walls? So I'm really, even when you walk down here, you can get all kinds of fossils in the rocks. I have a great time here. So in Switzerland, I'm driving with the pastor through the Rhone Valley, and all of a sudden I see this. And I say, we're going there. Now, I sort of forgot we're in the Alps, and going there looks close, but it's really, really far away. So it took us about an hour and a half to get where I wanted to go. And so here we'll get a close-up of this particular cut. Now, if you look at this mountain, oops. Oh, I thought I had it traced out. This mountain has been folded like a sandwich. Can you see the strata here? They actually go right around 180 degrees. How do you fold a mountain? How do you not crack it? If this was folded slowly over millions of years, there'd be so much heat buildup, there'd be no fossils in here. But this is the Jurassic period. There's lots of fossils in here. Lots of ammonites. There's a few dinosaurs, dinosaur stuff. But you can't do this unless this here is the same age as that up there, because it all folded at the same time, so it was like plasticine, right? It was like plasticine. It all folded. So you had all these strata laid down horizontally, and then a force came, a continental force came this way, pushed, and it folded like modeling pottery. And then you had another event over the top. And you can see that. See, there's other events that came over the top afterwards. So water was on top of this mountain after that event occurred. Now we're starting to look at global flood. We're at the top of the Alps here. Erosion. What do? Rivers, rain, wind all cause erosion. The effects, it dissolves mineral, drains the earth and minerals to the oceans, erodes continental coasts. Okay? What's the strength? In Science magazine, published in 2004, the results of a 5-year study on the Gorges River, which is in the U.S., showed that 10 to 20 meters of solid rock had been cut in 35,000 years. That's really fast from a geological perspective. So how much rock can you cut in 1 billion years? You cut the whole continent. I mean, if you continue, let's look here in Europe. It's called Erosion Project. The European coasts are being eroded by the ocean at a worrisome rate. 1/5 of the littoral coast has already been affected. The coasts are receding at a rate of 1/2 to 2 meters a year, sometimes up to 15 meters per year in the worst cases. So you do that for 1 million years, that's 2 million meters. How many kilometers is that? 2,000? Now, if you left at the edge of France, Calais, and went 2,000 meters in, what's left of Europe? Nothing. In 1 million years, you have no more Europe. See the problem of trying to make these really long processes? If we look at the processes that are happening today, they're going way too fast. What the key to the present shows us is that things happened at a different rate in the past, because we just saw all those strata being built, different processes. But if we take what's happening today and go backwards, it just doesn't work with these long ages. Some estimates from geologists show that the North American continent will be completely flat in 10 million years. 10 million years is a ridiculous amount of time. But consider they think dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. Water covers 71% of the planet. If you raise the Mariana Trenches, or the deep trenches of the ocean, and you lower the mountains a bit, get them a little bit more equidistant, you'd have over 3 kilometers of water on top of the earth today. There's a reason why it's called the blue planet. 71% of water. There's lots of water today on the earth to cover the earth by kilometers. All right. Having fun yet? Keep quiet. In mountain ranges, a rate of erosion of 1 meter per 1,000 years is commonplace. So think of that. 1 meter per 1,000 years in the Himalayas. So why do mountains always still exist with fossils dated at several millions of years old? Does that make sense? Fossils are millions of years old, but look at the rate. 1 meter per 1,000 years. You're going to have no more mountain in 100,000 years. Millions of years? No. This shows that the earth is young. Sedimentary strata of all ages are perfectly conserved in mountain regions. Where's the erosion? You notice when we look at the strata, it's flat everywhere. Now, it can be folded, but you understand strata between strata, they're always flat. They may be tilted, but they're flat. There's no erosion. But if you go outside and look at what water does, you see riverbeds, you see cut-throughs, you get a good storm, typhoon, you get these things, it just wipes out, just digs through. Water, there are situations where we can see where there's been large floods that I'll talk about this afternoon, where the water sees a mountain range and says, oh, a mountain range, whew, cuts right through it. That's the strength of water. And you look at the strata, everything's flat. I like to ask my evolutionary colleagues, where is the countryside? When I look at strata, there's no countryside. There's no nice hills. There's nothing. It's just flat. What, the dinosaurs were walking around in plains worldwide? And then they drowned? It's not coherent. It is coherent. Other things, salt. How are we doing in time? We're doing good. Quantity of the salt in the oceans, 14 point, would limit it. Let's do the calculation. 14,700 millions of tons of salt are in the oceans of the world. Who got to do that calculation? Don't ask me. Ultimate limit of 62 million years for the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, what's the problem with that? The problem is between the North American, or the American and the European, African continents, there's supposed to be 200 million years that we've been separating. But the amount of salt in the ocean only represents 62 million years. So that's a problem. Now you say 62 is a lot more than 6,000. Yeah, but God didn't have to start with fresh water everywhere. In fact, it's very unlikely that he started with fresh water since we have saltwater species that are specifically saltwater species. But if you take the amount of salt springs that are in the ocean, you actually lower that dramatically to within the time frame of just several thousand years. I won't go through all this, but this is, if you look at sediment in the ocean, it's the same thing. You end up with the amount of sediment that's being transported to the ocean, and you end up with this situation. The oceans could not, if you measure the sediment, be older than 30 million years old. So in other words, I'm looking at all kinds of areas, and I'm not seeing any evidence for an old Earth. The only place we're finding evidence for an old Earth is radiometric dating. This picture I took when I was in Joggins, Nova Scotia. I took 24 people there. Now it's a heritage site, but at the time, you could go and pick fossils that had dropped off the cliff, sort of like you can in Dorset, but we have better fossils. Better fossils, different fossils. And as you can see, they're well preserved. And this is a tree in the rock. So the question is, did this tree just stick around for 100,000 years while it got fossilized from the roots up? It's a polystrate tree. And there are so many of them, they think they're forests. The problem with the idea is that they're forests is that they never have any branches, and they have all their rootlets are taken off. So this wasn't actually forest, it's that they all moved in a mud flow. But it's all, the strata don't represent any age difference in reality. It doesn't make sense. So these are polystrate fossils. These are found actually all over the world. Here's blood cells. For those who saw the dinosaur talk, I talked about red blood cells in a T-Rex knee. How long do you want those to stick around? 65 million years, you get red blood cells stick around? In fact, this afternoon at 5, whenever we finish, we're going to go down, whoever wants to join us downstairs, I'm going to have the microscope that we saw yesterday. And so anybody who wants to see relatively fresh, non-fossilized dinosaur cells, bone cells, I will have the microscope downstairs and you can look at the Triceratops cells, non-fossilized. How old can they be? They're not fossilized. Okay? This lady has shown that these this was a T-Rex bone she cut. See the red blood cells, collagen, pulled it 17 times. How could that be? How could that be? Of course, this is still reactive. And so then we have the one that I'm going to show later on, this is Triceratops blood. That's in the scanning electron microscopy. It was published by Mark Armitage, vessel. So we get all these things, we start looking at, everything shows a young age. And you'll see here it says, what's the theory of billion years old? There's only one method possible, radiometric dating. Speculative hypothesis and often proven false. Based upon a phenomenon that operates over millions of years, it's out of the realm of testable science. Remember the observation? Remember our two little spheres? You don't see it, you're on shaky ground. Theory of thousands of years. It's confirmed by multiple geochronological methods that we've just seen. Only hypothesis is that the processes are constant in the past. That's the only hypothesis we're making. We're saying what we see now is constant. We're not even saying necessarily that a flood did it. We're just saying let's take the constant rates of the degradation of the magnetosphere. Let's take the constant rate of sedimentation, salt in the ocean, sediments in the ocean. And it doesn't work. The effects of degradation phenomena are observable and quantifiable. And geological strata formation and fossilization do not support the idea of long ages. John 8:31-32. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, if you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. See, we need to Jesus gave us a mission to bring the good news. And the good news is that God created us recently, just like Jesus said. And he had a plan for everybody. That's good news. We're not here by mistake. And things are matching up with what the Bible says every day. And the Bible indicates that it's a recent creation. If you look at Exodus 20:11, which is part of the Ten Commandments, what does God say? He says, God created in the beginning, in 6 days, God created everything, the I'm thinking it in French. I've got to remember it in English. Someone get out Exodus 20:11. Someone must have a Bible here. Come on. Who's got a Bible? Does this mic work? I want someone to read it in real English as opposed to my English. So find someone who has a Bible who will read me Exodus 20:11, who has a good voice. Who has a good voice? But who has a Bible? Okay.
For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
Part of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, keep the Sabbath. Unfortunately, we sort of consider thou shalt not kill more important than keep the Sabbath, but it's all part of the 10 Commandments. Keep the Sabbath means keeping 1 day of rest. Very interesting. God said he created in 6 days everything. The heavens, the earth, what's in the water. Now, there are places in the Bible we are not really prone to interpret. And the 10 Commandments has got to be one of those places. God wrote it with his hand. We don't like, oh, thou shalt not kill. How should we interpret that? Maybe it doesn't mean quite what it says. Huh? Thou shalt not kill means thou shalt not kill. That's pretty simple. And so when it talks about God creating in 6 days, he created in 6 days. When Jesus said it was done recently, it was. And that's good news. Because that's a plan. That's just part of the plan. Jesus sat with the disciples. When he walked with the disciples after his resurrection, he explained to them from the writings of Moses. He couldn't explain to them from the New Testament. Didn't exist yet. Right? He was explaining from the Old Testament, and their hearts burned within them. Yes, it's a good news message. There's an answer to all this catastrophe that we see in the rock records. And it makes sense. Why? I'll finish with this. We got a good time. We're actually running really good time. And so you'll be happy. That means don't come back late when we start at 2, right? Okay. Someone asked me if I believe in extraterrestrial life. In fact, I know what we can do. We can take some question and answers after I say this. That's a good opportunity. We didn't do that before. Someone asked me a question, do I believe in extraterrestrial life? And I said, well, I do. And this is what happened. Aliens came to Earth, and they went to a university science class, and they had just observed what was happening. And they heard the teacher expound on how material that was non-living somehow popped and became a living cell. They didn't know how, but it happened. And then they talked about how the living cell somehow, magically, I guess, sort of became a fish. Well, there's a lot of difference between a fish, but it happened. Maybe some worms before that and some trilobites. And then the fish decided they didn't like it in the water after millions of years of living there. They said they'd walk up on land, but they got halfway there and sort of stopped, and so you had the amphibians come around the frogs. And then the frogs, we don't know exactly how, but they decided they didn't want to stay in water either, or the amphibians, and they came out and became reptiles. Now, the insect came out, we don't know where, but that's what happened. And we believe it because we know it happened that way because we're here. And so then the reptiles, well, then some birds sort of appeared, and so these really, really, really big reptiles became these really, really, really small birds. But, that's how it works. And we don't know how that works. And then, after all these hundreds of millions of years, then the mammals appear, right? The mammals appear after the reptiles, dinosaurs. You got the mammals appear. And so the mammals are very interesting creatures because after hundreds of millions of years, I don't know, 75, 80 million years, drop in a bucket, they decided they wanted to go back to their roots, back to the water. And so some mammals that are basically close to a camel or a camel or a cow, decided that they go back into the water and become dolphins and whales, which weigh up to 50 tons. And then the process goes on, and then, of course, you had monkeys appear, and they somehow walked out of trees, and the grass was too high after an earthquake in Africa. And so because, just like giraffes, their necks grew because the leaves were higher up on the trees, the grass was too high in the savanna, and so they learned to walk upright, and they became humans. Aliens went back to their planet and said to their leader, there is life on Earth, but it's not intelligent. That's my answer to extraterrestrial life. All right. So, why don't we go for some question and answers, and then we'll wrap it up. Who has? You have to raise your hand, and I'll repeat it. Try not to get into the feedback here. Anybody have questions? Yes, sir. Oh, they're going to run around with the mic. That's a great idea. Great idea.
Thank you. I mean, the evidence that you've given points unmistakably to creation. And I think you mentioned that even in North America, most people in their hearts don't believe in evolution. But we have to find a way of making it presentable to the people. I mean, the scientists are just sort of winning, and the media people seem to be winning the battle, really. But we've got to find a way through prayer, I think, of overcoming it. I think one of the things that we tend to talk about fossils and all these very clever things, and people get a bit switched off because fossils, only a few people know anything about fossils, really. But there's lots of really, I mean, perhaps there are lots of really straightforward things that everybody can understand. I mean, if we had developed from gorillas or from apes, we should see apes everywhere. It's not only fossils. We should see them in Tesco's. We should see them we should see them on the beaches. We should see them on the mountains. We should see them in Morrison's. They should be in our schools everywhere. We should be seeing.
Well, there are monkeys in our schools, maybe. So what's the question?
So there's no question really, but just the question is how to get people to see what's really obvious apart from prayer.
Yeah, well, it's a combined thing. Prayer is essential, and I know CMI has prayer time. I have a prayer group that's praying for me now as I'm here, because it's a delusion, right? It's a delusion. I believe that it's part of the end time delusion that even the elect can lose their faith, because we've seen many of the elect lose their faith associated with evolution. I'm going to tell you a story that your pastor told me. Now, he's probably upstairs, right? He's watching. He's watching. So you have to run down really fast if you're going to correct me. He told me that he was in the Philippines and he was working missionary work, and he'd seen a lot of active spirituality in the streets and occultism and stuff. And when he came back to England, he was struck by the spiritual hardness on people's faces in contrast to where he was. And he asked God, why is there this spiritual hardness? And God gave him one word: evolution. That's a powerful thing. It's a powerful testimony. And that's how strong that delusion is. But the reason why people believe that is because they don't want to believe in God. Remember my percentages? The reality is the evolutionists are in the minority. They just happen to control the universities, and they control the jobs of certain levels of, a lot of us don't work in evolution anyway. And there are a lot of creationists out there that are scientists that don't admit it because they'd lose their job. As Mark Armitage did when he published on the dinosaur cells, and within 3 months he'd lost his job. And he was published. So it's a dangerous thing to come out and say, I'm a creationist. Oh, then you're out of this university. Even now they have to use the Supreme Court of the U.S. to dictate what you are and are not allowed to ask in a science class in the high schools and colleges in the U.S. Since when was science education have to be dictated by legislation? That is something special. That's because their arguments are so weak. It doesn't make sense. You look around you. Where's the country? See, what I would do, answer your question, how can we make it easy? Were you there last night? Oh. Then maybe pick up the video, prove that God exists, or something that the church will put on the website or whatever. You use the logic. There's matter. You either believe in two things: eternal matter or eternal intelligence that's non-matter, as in creator, spiritual creator. If you believe in eternal matter, you have a problem because matter degrades. Everybody can understand it. You can see it happening. So matter can't be eternal, so there's only one other choice. You believe in long times in strata? How come there's no erosion in the strata? I never thought about that before. You want us to come from monkeys? I'll explain this afternoon. Oh, okay, or from the ancestors of chimps? Sort of looks like a chimp anyway. What? How do you get them to walk upright? I don't have to prove their theory wrong until they prove it's right. Remember that. If you come out of here with one thing tonight, today. Come out with the onus is on them to prove their theory. Because when I look around me, cows produce cows, dogs produce dogs, beetles produce beetles, monkeys produce monkeys, and humans produce humans. That's exactly what Genesis says. I mean, if humans weren't producing humans, I guess they'll close the windows in every hospital because we don't know what's going to come out. Some major evolutionary leap that doesn't leave a fossil. Okay? So there's lots of opportunities. The Answer book will help with that. They have lots of pamphlets out there that will help with that. The CMI does. And you can see me use some of this information on my DVD where I do the debate. Because there I'm live. I'm just going bang, 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 bang. Quick things that people can understand. Pick up the DVD. I think it'll be useful to you. Okay. Other questions? How are we doing? We're doing good.
Yes, over here. I'm a primary school teacher, and what you've been hearing in the news about Mr. Gove, our Minister of Education and everything. There's a new primary curriculum coming in, and evolution is going to be taught in that. So I think you've answered part of the question in what you've just been saying. But just to make parents of primary children aware that it's going to be taught to your children in school without an option. I was actually trying to organize a field trip to see Laurence talk, and my head teacher, who is a Christian, said he was too extreme. And I don't know if anyone else thinks he's too extreme. But probably my question is, do you have any information on what happens to children from like primary age to university and college? Because I know we've been talking about these things because that's what I that's what I do with the kids. Give them both sides, let them. But most of them are creation of some kind of shape or another. Mm-hmm. What happens to them as they progress through the education system?
Excellent question. The issue starts long before primary school. It starts because we leave the TV be the mother of our kids. And the TV shows National Geographic and shows PBS or whatever you have here, Discovery Channel. And what do they have on them? 3D animations of evolution. Totally no facts to support it, but it sure looks good. And how does a 3-year-old, from looking at a TV, how does it understand how does it know that that's not true? It can't. It's looking around it. It's discovering everything. Till 6 years old, that brain's all modeling all kinds of stuff. And it's just taking what it receives as fact. And the problem is in the church, we do the Sunday schools, and we have Noah's Ark as a cartoon. We have the Garden of Eden as a cartoon. Which are you going to believe? Apes becoming men out of Africa in 3D with real actors that look the Planet of the Apes? Or are you going to believe cartoons that you're showing on Sunday? You're going to believe 3D. You're 3 years old. You are not able to make the difference. So we start there. Let's start showing them the truth. There's stuff out there. There's DVDs out there. CMI has DVDs that will show them the truth. And they understand a lot more than you think they do at a very young age. And even if they don't understand, it gives them a basis by which to compare. So they can, that was different. One of the first talks I gave, David, one of the first talks I did in 1990 outside of university, because I thought all Christians were creationists, so I didn't think I needed to speak in any churches. I found out that was wrong. So I was only speaking in universities and school context in Quebec. And then a church asked me to come and speak, and so I came and spoke, and on the age of the earth, actually. And so it was my first talk outside of a church. And I'll never forget the question and answer period, because a parent who had a child that was in 3rd year primary school, she said, the teacher presented that we came from monkeys, and my son said, no, we don't. We were created. And the teacher said this, and the son at that age was able to remember the response. He said, the teacher said, you've been brainwashed by your parents, lied to by your parents. And now it'll be state enforced. So how do you deal with that? First of all, the Bible is very clear. Train up a child as the way he should go. That's our responsibility as parents and as a church. But it's not only the church responsibility. You only are here one day a week or whatever. You have the cell group maybe twice a week. So it's got to be our responsibility to look after our kids. Okay, so we are responsible. And we're responsible to get them the right information, be able to answer the questions, and don't be able to not shy away from anything. That's why I have this ministry. That's why Dominic is speaking. That's why, so you can become informed, so you can inform your youth when they get formed. Now, the next thing you're going to have trouble with is hypocrisy. Children are very sensitive to hypocrisy. And they're going to be insulted when they know the truth and get into primary school or at the end of primary school, and they'll say, that's wrong. And then they get insulted, and you can have an issue with attitude in the classroom. So you have to teach them respect. The person can be teaching something wrong, and they have to understand why that is. The person isn't a Christian. They don't have the same worldview. They're not seeing the same things. We have to still be respectful. But if we can teach them to ask the right questions in a respectful way, it can overturn everything. And that's the same key at the higher ages, when you get into high school or whatever you call it, and college. I actually made a kit in Quebec called a student survival kit. And in it, I actually went through the biology book and went paragraph by paragraph what questions they should ask. I mean, this was deadly. And not only that, I told them, you're going to get this response, give this follow-up question. I mean, it was deadly. And so they got hold of this, and they've now changed I'm not saying it's just because of that, but they changed the biology book and took evolution out of it in Quebec. It was creating too much controversy. I even had praise the Lord. I even had the University of Three Rivers, Trois-Rivières, which is in between Quebec City and Montreal. When the teacher at the university level was going to speak on evolution, she says, I know Laurence Tisdall doesn't believe this, but I'm going to teach it anyway, just to avoid having a bunch of questions from the students. So we can impact our generation if we stand up and talk, if we stand up for what we believe, but we got to have this combination of knowledge, respect, and build up our kids, and stop showing cartoons. There's a lot of stuff out there now in English that's 3D. Let's get some real stuff out there. I understand at 2 years old and 1 we show cartoons, but 3 years old they want to. If you've got them in front of the TV, you better get the other story. Even better, turn off the TV or disconnect cable and just use DVDs or something. There was a time when kids played in sandboxes, and they had a good time, and they didn't grow up like demented or anything. It sounds bizarre. Kids don't know that. You mean there's no such thing as we or any? What do we do with our thumbs? Anyway. Okay, another question. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
I'm a secondary school science teacher. I'm very, very grateful for you coming just to help fill in, give us the facts that we need so we can back up our arguments. It does make me sick when I have to teach evolution, and I have to teach it as if it is fact. And I know myself that, it's just a pack of lies. But whenever I teach it, I just sort of run through it in a brief way, and I say, okay, this is what evolution states. And I say that you don't have to believe this. I say that, everyone in this room is free to believe what they want. And I give my own point in it, that I believe in the creator.
You do that in the classroom?
I do that in the classroom. I say that as a teacher of science, the further I go into science, the more evidence I see for a creator God.
So what's your contingency for your further career?
My faith, I have to be honest.
That's fantastic.
Yeah? Honest. I have no idea how you could be a scientist and an atheist, because the more I see, just as you showed that animation for the DNA, I've showed that in my classroom. And then after that, I say, how can you look at that and say that was an accident? And most of the kids in there will say, it doesn't look like an accident to me. So I give both sides. Because as far as I'm concerned, the more we understand, the more it becomes so obvious that there has to be a creator.
It is. And again, that's why Paul talks about they are without excuse. Because God has really left his signature strong in creation. And very good. I'm glad you're able to. In Quebec, you'd be out of a job. You'd be severely reprimanded, even though they have a really good union, teachers union. you'd be severely reprimanded, and you'd probably lose you'd probably lose your subject of teaching. I actually had the experience of doing a bachelor's in education in science teaching, and I was doing some student teaching at the largest high school in Quebec, south of Montreal, and I happened, God arranges these things, I happened to come into the biology course when they were about to teach evolution. I was 31 years old, so I'm a mature student, and I'm thinking, how am I going to teach evolution? How am I going to do that? So I look at it, and it turns out the teacher was a Muslim, and so she was a creationist, doesn't believe the Bible, but she was a creationist, and she said, oh, I'm really interested about what you're talking about, what you know. On the first class, give 3 evidences for creation, then we'll do all the evolution. Does that make sense? Even the book on manual that the government gives out on how to teach on origins, it says the first class discuss multiple origins. But that's only in theory. They never actually do it. But it's there. And so I put out 3 evidences: law of biogenesis, second law of thermodynamics, and probably information. And it disappeared with all my printouts of evolution and everything. And then my class was coming up, and I happened to be going to be evaluated in that class, the first one, which is someone that gets the first class to evaluate, and it's going to be me. And my photocopies weren't showing up. So I started searching, who's got my photocopies? What's happened? We find them on a principal's desk. Written on it, creationist, problem student. So I walk into the principal, and she says, I can see you're a very arrogant person. Now, that was her first sentence. I'd never spoken to her in my life. Now, I may have some problem, pride or arrogance. I'm sure everybody, I guess, fights that a bit. I'm human. But I hadn't spoken to her. How could she know that? I hadn't even taught yet. I mean, I'd done nothing but do photo. And she said, look, if you mention one word on creation, we will fail your evaluation. Okay? So I taught on evolution. Their average went from 73 to 85%, the class average. So they really understood evolution. And when I finished, almost nobody believed it. I never said what I believe. In fact, they got really frustrated. They said, you don't believe this, do you? And I said, I can't answer that question. So they were like really frustrated. But what I did was, there's a lot of things coming out in the news. For those who read French, there's a journal called Science et Vie, which is Science and Life. And I bought the most recent one just a few days ago. And it's page after page is creationist. Oh, the model doesn't work. The model doesn't work. Oh, this doesn't work. And so all I did was get them up. Would you read this morning? This is what has just happened in science. Understanding that their science is at least 10 years old and maybe more. So she gets up and reads it, or the student gets up, and then they say, wait a second. We were just taught something different. Yeah, I said, but science changes. Your exam, you'll have to answer this, but science is changing. So it left them in that beautiful flux of science is not establishing truth. Science is trying to discover God. And there's a great new biology textbook written by Kurt Wise. It's not for sale. He doesn't have the graphics done yet, but he's giving it as a course. It's called Devotional Biology. And he's decided, instead of looking at all of nature through naturalistic eyesight, why don't we look at it through the characteristics of God? God's Trinity. God's omniscient. He's a designer. He's perfect. He's powerful. So he goes through all the different aspects of God, and then he starts looking at nature through that. And he says, wow, you can actually subdivide nature up into the characteristics of God, just as Romans 1 said. And I think, yeah, that's a really good idea, devotional biology. Because looking at God's creation should bring us into a state of worship.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That means that you can actually use their language, but fill it with all the doubts and all the problems of evolution and just give that back to them.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. We'll take one last question.
Sorry, over here. You spoke a bit about the various dating methods, and you mentioned that a lot of them aren't very accurate. And I think you asked one of the questions, or someone asked, is there a better method? I mean, are scientists looking at more accurate methods for dating, or is the fact that your beginning assumption, your beginning variable is an assumption, i.e., the quantity of a certain substance at a certain period in time, however long ago, just simply flawed and makes it almost impossible?
So yes, of course, they have multiple dating methods. They may have 6 or something, but how do you calibrate them? You have to go back to the fossils. And how do you know the age of the fossils? Because of the sediment. How do you know the age of the sedimentary rock? Because of the fossils. So the problem is calibration. Can't calibrate. So yeah, but the other problem is they always end up with the same dates because they've already decided what the date is, right? So we got 5 different dates. They all give the same date. Yeah, because you've thrown out everything that isn't. So, like I said, let me give you one final thing before you leave. Uranium, remember we talked about uranium lead? Okay, uranium, which is one of the oldest datings. Uranium changes to, I think it's plutonium. I was going to say plutonium. I think it's plutonium. Anyway, you probably don't know anyway. But uranium changes to that first level of thorium or plutonium right away. It releases helium. If you measure the rate of change, you get these billions of years. But if you measure the rate of helium, you get a rock that's 6,000 years old. So the rock, with the same dating method, will give you billions of years and a few thousand years, depending on which part you're looking at of the equation. Now that's really interesting, because now as creationists, we look at those radiometric methods and say, there's got to be a reason why they're giving old ages. Even if they're not valid, they're much older than the Earth is. So why? And it means accelerated radioactivity. But if we accelerate radioactivity, we sort of burn up. So how do we accelerate radioactivity and not burn up? Well, you have to stretch the universe. And there are specific times when when creationists are starting to look at suggesting that God stretched the universe, which he says he did in Psalms, stretch the universe like a curtain. During the flood and during the crucifixion of Christ, when there was that 3 hours, everything went black. So we're looking at specific times, and there seems to be some evidence in the data measurements, to show that something happened with radioactivity that sped it up without affecting us. And that would start explaining these dates that are much older, even though they're all over the board, that are much older than the thousands of years.